This exhibition here at the Pretoria Art Museum represents 22 years of my life while I lived in New York from 1981 to 2003. So this body of work covers an enormous arc of time, not only in real time, but in terms of my own evolution as a woman and a becoming feminist. When I arrived in New York in 1981, within a few months thereafter, my marriage broke down. So I had the choice to come back home with my two children or to stay in New York. And I realized that if I came home, my children would grow up without their father. So I chose to remain. But this whole translocation created a fracture in my identity. I was fractured, I was broken, I was scared, I was in shreds. And the very first works I created there were these sort of life-size self-portraits that I pasted together from various drawings of various parts of my body. And in these things I had X-rays, I had photocopies of my arms and hands, I had copies of my birth certificate, of my marriage certificate, and of the birth certificates of my children to kind of attest to my identity. So I felt that I was pasting myself together from various and sundry parts that constitute me. I also represented my face as a mask, because one, under difficult and painful situations like that, you sort of don a mask of competency, which I also had to do because I was raising a preteen and a teenager on my own. And of course, in that time of transition, my identity as a South African artist was shattered, and I had not yet acquired an American identity. My identity as wife no longer held any comfort, so I had to find different ways of dealing with this brokenness within myself. And of course, there was always, across this whole arc of time in New York, there was always the longing for South Africa. During those early years in New York, I learned photography and darkroom from Harold Feinstein, who's a well-known American photographer. And in my quest to hold on to myself, I turned to self-portraiture. So I took a lot of self-photos. And at the same time, I realized that I was returning the gaze. And by this I mean the gaze that John Berger was talking about in Ways of Seeing, when he wrote, "Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only the relations of men to women, but the relation of women to themselves." So women look at themselves as objects of the male gaze, and this sort of works its way throughout the history of painting and the history of the nude in art, where women's naked bodies are objectified. What I did in turning the camera on my own half-naked body was to return the gaze to myself, and instead of objectifying my nakedness or my nudity, was to become the subject of my own gaze. In the early 1980s, I came across a book called Women's Images of Men. And it was a book that was written after an exhibition that was in London at the International Institute of Contemporary Art. And it was an interesting idea that grabbed hold of me, because up until that time I have worked with mostly self-images and, returning the gaze with turning the camera on myself. But this gave me a whole other idea, because the question in this exhibition was to find the erotic potential in the male nude. Now, I wasn't interested in that, but the idea of women creating images of male figures fascinated me, and I started creating male images and effigies and trying to sort of extract my idea of male energy. This is actually an exploration that fits this whole wall behind me, and it was also an exploration that held me captive for at least 10 years, that I worked with various male energies and effigies. And at a point in time, I started making these big seated, barrel-chested figures that had no arms and no heads. And the idea for me there was that so much of how we perceive ourselves as women have traditionally over the years been through the words of men, through the writings of men, from Plato and Aristotle to St. Augustine, the church, the patriarchy that I grew up under. It told us how to be women, how to understand ourselves as women. So in these big barrel-chested, headless figures, I removed the heads deliberately to put the focus into the chest and into the heart and into the guts, rather than into the intellect that prescribes how things should be. I have also, in many of these figures, eliminated the arms so that the grasp of ownership is removed thereby. While I lived in New York, the Metropolitan Museum was my home from home. And I was particularly grasped by the full frontal stillness of ancient Egyptian statuary. And that full frontal image has played out in much of my work during this period that I did all the male explorations. There's something very still about the symmetry of a seated figure facing forward, and I employed that a lot throughout. Also, I was reading Joseph Campbell's book on primitive mythology, and having grown up in the Free State on a cattle and sheep farm, horned animals played a large part in my childhood landscape. And in the mythologies of well, he called them primitive people, but I would just say really clever, insightful people, used the idea of horns and horned figures in their mythologies and in their totem animals and so on. So I have used the idea of the horned figure kind of extensively during this period of time. This also eventually led to a limited edition artist's book that I made with 10 woodcuts and with a long bilingual poem that writes to this idea of moving back through the corridors of time and finding ancient sounds and rituals that have been forgotten. And this was all part of my reformation of the angry, stern patriarch of childhood, of the patriarch. I was reading Esther Harding's book, Women's Mysteries, Ancient and modern. She is one of the sort of seminal Jungian feminist therapists and writers and thinkers of the 70s and 80s. And the idea of nature being sacred and outdoor spaces being sacred really came up for me during the time I was reading her works. So the idea of outdoor shrines and monoliths and places in nature made with rock and stone and tree and hilltops really grabbed my imagination. And this was the beginning of a period that followed on the Reformed Patriarch that I did during the male explorations. And this was finding passages through and out and into a changed landscape. And of course, in the process of finding this changed landscape, I realized you have to go through the mother. And I don't mean by this my biological mother, but the idea of mother, the idea of earth, the idea of goddess, the idea of a changed gender in the image of God, is to go through the mother to this changed landscape. And that influenced me for a long time. I was drawing myself as a tree, which is, of course, a very interesting symbol because a tree simultaneously grows up as it grows down and buries itself in the soil, and it is also a mirror image of itself. So the tree, not only because of its sort of mythological and symbolic meaning, was also a great idea for me, because on the farm where I grew up, a tree was like a magical oasis. You know, in the Free State, it's flat and barren, and the horizon is 360 degrees around you. So wherever there was a tree, we as children would climb it, and it would just be our haven. New York City is a city of books. There are many booksellers, bookstores, booksellers on the streets and everywhere, and I just love books. I have my best conversations and arguments with the authors of books. I annotate in the margins and argue with them or agree with them or expand on what they have to say. So that is also where a lot of my thinking and my ideas come from. And at the time, I was reading the works of Maria Gimbutas. She's an archaeologist that did extensive work on excavating in Turkey or in old Anatolia. And this was a time before patriarchy. It was a time before the written word. So what is left there are images. And of course, her interpretation of the images take us back to the Great Mother, take us back to the reverence for the goddess. So I was thinking to myself, okay, as a lapsed Calvinist, what do I do with this? I am not a particular believer in any particular faith, but religion has woven itself through my thinking and through my world. And how would I create goddess? So as I was reading Maria Gimbutas and the things the women did, spinning yarn and weaving cloth, I thought, the spinners. This is such a wonderful metaphor for growing and becoming. So I started this thinking around what eventually became my book, Song of the Spinners. But I started with the idea of women growing and tending flax, and then harvesting the flax, and then preparing the flax into fibers and spinning the fibers into yarn, and using the yarn to weave, create a weaving frame and create this wonderful fabric. So in that process and in my thinking, this fabric manifested goddess. So to me, that was the idea of creating goddess for me. out of the Song of the Spinners and my idea of women's work of spinning and weaving that is sacred work came the idea of a sacred mirror. I was reading Patricia Lynn Riley's book, God Who Looks Like Me, and that was an interesting idea. We are so used to, in our Abrahamic religions, to see God as God the Father. How about God the Mother? And how do we access God the Mother? Who is God the Mother, God the female? So I started working with posing my models facing each other in postures of devotion, and I called this whole series of works Sacred Mirror. And the idea was that through our devotion, through our prayers, we actually create the sacred other that mirrors us. So that was the sacred mirror for me, and this led to a whole exploration that eventually lived under the overarching title Post-Christian Altar Images, of which there are some examples in this exhibition as well. For the past 2 millennia, patriarchal monotheism has effectively kept women on the margins of religious thought and religious office. In a series of 6 prayer books, 6 artists' prayer books, I have created etchings of these devotional figures, and I have deliberately filled the page with each figure, leaving only a tiny margin around it, reversing that idea of women being marginalized. And in this case, women's religious practice is at the center.